Most people don't fall behind financially because they earn too little. They fall behind because they learn the wrong rules early, internalize them as responsible, and then follow them consistently for years. This is why two people earning similar incomes can end up in completely different financial positions by their 30s. This isn't about shortcuts or trying to get rich fast. It's about the quiet, common mistakes that feel sensible in your 20s, but quietly compound against you over time. If you understand these early, you don't need perfect decisions. You just need to be directionally right for long enough. The first mistake is waiting to invest until you know more. This delay is often framed as caution. Someone in their 20s might say they'll start investing once they understand the market better, once they earn more money, or once things feel more stable. On the surface, that sounds responsible. But when you look at long-term evidence, this delay is one of the most expensive financial choices people make. Long-term market data from the S&P 500 shows that the dominant driver of returns isn't timing or intelligence, it's time in the market. Decades of compounding do the heavy lifting. Research from firms like Vanguard consistently shows that simple, early participation in diversified investments outperforms waiting for perfect knowledge, even when late starters try to invest more aggressively to catch up. Behavioral finance research also suggests that most delays aren't logical at all. They're emotional responses to uncertainty disguised as prudence. To make this concrete, imagine two people with similar incomes in their 20s. One starts investing small amounts early with basic diversification and consistency. The other waits 10 years, telling themselves they'll start once they feel confident and informed. Even if the second person invests more later, the early starter often ends up ahead simply because compounding had time to work. What most people do is wait for confidence before acting. What actually happens is that waiting removes the experience that creates confidence in the first place. What changes when this mistake is fixed is momentum. You stop trying to eliminate uncertainty and instead learn to operate within it. The core idea is simple. You don't become financially confident before you start investing. You become confident by starting, observing, and staying consistent. The fix isn't complexity or perfect timing. It's participation. The second mistake is treating cash as safety instead of a tool. Cash feels safe because it doesn't fluctuate and it doesn't trigger emotional discomfort. Someone might hold large amounts of cash because it feels stable and responsible. But when you look at historical inflation data from central banks, it becomes clear that cash quietly loses purchasing power over time. Even modest inflation compounds year after year, meaning the same amount of money buys less in the future than it does today. At the same time, long-term data on productive assets shows that while they fluctuate in the short term, they have historically outpaced inflation over longer periods. The real risk isn't volatility alone. The real risk is standing still while the cost of living rises around you. A common scenario looks like this. Someone keeps most of their money in cash because markets feel unpredictable. Years pass, and while their bank balance looks stable, their money quietly loses buying power. What most people do is equate stability with safety. What actually happens is erosion. What changes when this mistake is fixed is perspective. Cash stops being treated as a strategy and starts being treated as a tool. Cash is for liquidity, emergencies, and short-term certainty. It provides flexibility and peace of mind. But long-term money needs growth to preserve its value. The core principle is straightforward. Cash isn't bad. Misusing cash is. When cash is doing the wrong job, it creates a false sense of security. The third mistake, and this one is counterintuitive, is obsessing over budgeting instead of direction. Budgeting feels productive. Tracking expenses feels disciplined. Someone might spend hours refining spreadsheets and categorizing spending because it feels like control. But after looking at long-term wealth data and income mobility research, a consistent pattern appears. Budgeting helps prevent damage, but it doesn't create momentum. Most long-term financial progress comes from earning power, consistent investing, and time. Behavioral finance research also shows that people often mistake control for progress. They optimize expenses while ignoring larger levers like skill development, income growth, and asset allocation. A typical example is someone who perfectly manages their monthly spending but never meaningfully increases income or invests consistently. What most people do is over-optimize the small details because they're visible and measurable. What actually happens is that the biggest drivers of outcomes remain untouched. What changes when this mistake is fixed is focus. Budgeting becomes a baseline rather than the goal. The core takeaway is this: budgeting is foundational, not transformational. It helps stop leaks, but it doesn't build wealth by itself. Direction matters more than precision. Where your money goes over time matters far more than tracking every dollar it passes through. The fourth mistake is treating all debt as the same. Many people grow up hearing that debt is always bad, and while that advice sounds clean and safe, it's incomplete. After looking into capital allocation principles and long-term debt outcomes, it becomes clear that debt itself isn't the problem. Misaligned debt is. There are three variables that determine whether debt helps or hurts you: the interest rate, what the debt is used for, and what it replaces or delays. High-interest debt used for depreciating consumption is predictably destructive. It compounds stress, limits flexibility, and erodes future options. Lower-cost debt used thoughtfully, especially when it supports productive outcomes or long-term growth, behaves very differently. A common scenario looks like this. One person avoids all debt out of fear, even when low-cost options could support long-term goals. Another person takes on high-interest debt for short-term consumption and struggles for years. What most people do is apply blanket rules to complex decisions. What actually happens is that alignment gets ignored. What changes when this mistake is fixed is understanding. Debt stops being viewed as a moral issue and starts being evaluated as a financial tool. The core idea is clarity. Avoid debt that locks you into stress and stagnation. Be skeptical of any debt that costs more than it creates. Focus on alignment, not slogans. The fifth mistake is optimizing for short-term comfort over long-term optionality. Many people tell themselves they'll enjoy their 20s now and figure money out later. This mindset feels harmless, especially when framed as balance. But life cycle finance research shows that early decisions don't just affect net worth, they affect options. Small, boring habits early on create flexibility later, such as the ability to change careers, take calculated risks, or say no to situations you don't want to be in. Optionality is one of the most undertaught concepts in personal finance. A simple example is someone who builds basic financial discipline early. They don't live extremely, but they stay consistent. Years later, they have choices. What most people do is trade future flexibility for present comfort without realizing the cost. What actually happens is constraint later. What changes when this mistake is fixed is leverage. Early discipline isn't restriction, it's leverage. The core takeaway is grounding. You don't need extremes or perfection. You need consistency and a clear direction over time. To close, you don't need to be perfect with money in your 20s. You don't need to predict markets or optimize every decision. You need the right framework. When you understand how time, behavior, alignment, and optionality actually work, you stop reacting and start acting with confidence. If you want to actually understand money instead of guessing or reacting to headlines, subscribe. We'll build that financial literacy properly.